This collection includes accounts of disappearance, violence, non-graphic, suicide, mentions of minors, and traumatic distress. Reader discretion advised. I traced these stories through court records, scanned newspaper clippings, and hours of recorded testimony. Names, precise locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. The reconstructions you will read are drawn from witnesses' words, dispatch logs, and archival notes, and where necessary, I've filled gaps with plausible, clearly reconstructed lines. If a case remains unresolved, I state that below. If you find this material compelling, consider subscribing and hitting notifications. There are more accounts like these, and staying with the whole piece helps preserve the context each voice needs. I begin with a dispatcher who kept the night radio in a small logging town in western Washington. I was 23, and I worked nights at the county radio. The building sat on the edge of town where the pavement ended and the firs closed in. You could smell diesel and wet bark when you stepped outside. I had been on the shift that winter that didn't seem to end. Fog every night like someone pressed their thumb against the world. We logged calls, we patched ambulances, we rerouted log trucks when slides took out a road. It was dull work, and then, the night everything started, it wasn't. It was almost 2 in the morning when the line lit up with a call that came through as static and a child's voice. The voice wasn't a kid from around here. It had that thin, far-away thing people get when they're not used to being heard. "Help," she said, and in a sound like someone coughing into a sleeve. I checked the incoming lat long, but the GPS ping came back as a handful of coordinates on the edge of the county boundary, a place where cell service went to sleep and people still relied on CBs and heaters to make the night bearable. I remember the fog so thick you could taste it. It sat on the radio like a smear. I patched the call to a unit and asked the operator to mark it urgent. The caller cut in, "I'm by the White Cross." There are a lot of white crosses along those roads, memorials for people who never made it home. The tone of her voice changed when she said cross. It went smaller, like a pebble swallowed. "They're outside the trees," she whispered. She said something that night that I would replay in my head for years. "They're whispering numbers. They want me to keep counting." We sent a deputy. He radioed back he saw nothing but fog and tire tracks where something heavy had turned off the road. He said he'd walk the line, but the trees were tight. We had no visual, just his boots crunching in the leaf duff and a distant drip of water. The next transmission was not his voice. It was the radio picking up something, low and rhythmic, like a tape played at half speed. Under that, the dispatcher on the radio thought he heard a child's voice. "Don't leave me," repeated again and again, but stretched so the vowels were rubber. We combed the area for hours. It was the kind of search that felt like moving through old film, muffled, slow. We found no child. We found a small shoe on a branch, a child's shoe, mud-caked and alone, as if someone had taken it off and hung it to keep it dry. There were no prints beyond the shoe. The deputy marked it in his report and wrote that the shoe smelt like smoke but had not been burned. Archives show a missing juvenile report filed in the county the following morning. The family moved away weeks later. The investigation, as the files state, remained open. After that night, the radio started to pick up odd things. Cars that weren't there. Lines of static with the cadence of someone humming nursery rhymes backward. A technician later told me the frequencies were clean. There was no interference from the next county, no scheduled tests. But for months, anyone on nights would tell you about hearing a counting voice. Some nights it would repeat numbers that matched dates of old newspaper headlines we found later, disappearances from years back. People joked about haunted frequencies until they began to avoid the northern road at night. I stopped doing midnight shifts after the spring thaw. Some nights I would wake and the clock on my bedside would be wrong by minutes I couldn't account for, as if the night had taken its quota and left the rest broken. Next, a long-haul trucker recounts his run along a coastal highway. I drove 18-wheeler routes up and down the coast for 20 years. The highway skirts the water in places, clinging to cliff and tree, and in fog, it's like driving through a bowl. That night, I was hauling timber slash to a mill that was already half silent. The air tasted of salt and oil. I remember the headlights cutting columns out of the mist and the road reflecting them like a mirror. I first saw the van behind me just after the Moon Creek turnoff. It came up slow and stayed close, too close for the speed I was keeping. No plates, no company logo, nothing but a box of black. It stayed a few lengths behind and flashed high beams once, twice. I checked my mirrors. The van's windows were dark, but at one point I think I saw someone shift in the driver's seat, like the motion of someone adjusting a cap. The highway there is narrow, with 2 lanes and no real shoulder. I signaled and moved into the right lane to let it pass, but when I glanced again, the van had closed the gap and slid in behind me, following like it had been attached. My rear view with a string. I called the dispatcher on Channel 12. I told her I had a tail. She asked if I wanted her to call the state cops. I said not yet. I thought maybe the van would pass at the next straight. It didn't. At one point, I took the county road by the old lighthouse to shake it. My truck has a lot of blind spots, but I remember turning off and slowing to 20, and the van matching speed without headlights, just black glass and tires whispering over wet asphalt. For 40 miles it stayed with me. 40 miles is a long time to be watched. It turns your skin to something thin and cold. When I finally pulled into a diner at the edge of town to use the phone, I left my lights on and the engine idling. The van stopped on the opposite side of the parking lot and the diner went quiet. I saw a face at the passenger window. It was pale and blank, like the room had been washed out. The face didn't belong to any race or age I could pin down. It had a softness to the features that didn't belong on a living person. I remembered a sound then, like a spoon tapping a glass in an empty house. When I went outside to breathe, the van was gone. There were no skid marks, no one in the street. The local cop told me this kind of thing happens around there. People do follow trucks, but he recorded my statement and logged it as unverified pursuit. Weeks later, my co-driver called and said he'd been in the exact place and seen the same van. He told me he caught it on a dash cam a year before, a clip where the van follows a rig until it flickers and the pixels go black. I asked to see it. The clip was grainy, loops of road and headlights, and then nothing. He told me he deleted it because it made him ill. I kept a copy, hidden on a hard drive. Sometimes, late at night, I pull it up, and the image moves like someone breathing through a thin cloth. The authorities marked a couple of plates in the area as belonging to unregistered vehicles, nothing further. The mill manager avoided questions. People at the diner said the van had been seen for decades, following different rigs, a rumor that grew like lichen on a stone. I quit the long runs after that summer. I still drive local drops, and on the coast I always take an extra turn to look back, to make sure nothing is riding my tail. A park ranger from an inland reserve talks about clocks and vanished hours. I began my summers at the reserve when I was 20. The place sits in a bowl of trees with a small town stretched along its mouth. People came to the trails for blackberries and for the river at the bottom where the light breaks through. There was a town clock in the square, the kind with a heavy face and brass hands that needed winding in the autumn. The clock had stopped for reasons nobody could quite remember, and then it hadn't stopped. It had started running backward. It began with small things. Hikers who said their watches had slipped time, losing an hour and then finding it again. A woman on the North Trail told me she had left the visitor center at 10 and found herself at the picnic loop at 8, 2 hours earlier on the plaque at the trailhead. She was sure of her times because she had checked her phone. The phone, she said, flashed time in odd ways. Not a regional glitch, but numbers that didn't align with cell towers, as if whatever device we used to hold the world steady had hiccuped. The clock in the square became the town's oddity. People would stand and watch the hands move backward, like a comedian reversing a trick. Kids dared each other to touch the base at night. The clockmaker came down from the county seat and wound it and said in a small voice that the gears were worn, the way old wood is worm-eaten, but he could find nothing mechanically wrong to explain the reversal. The papers wrote about local legend and a seasonal peculiar. Archival notes marked dozens of calls to the sheriff's office, reports of time loss, witnesses claim missing hours. One evening I rode the loop because I'd been on a long shift. The trail was so thick with fog that my lantern made a little halo and the trees beyond it vanished. I heard voices ahead, two people talking, but the words slurred like someone was playing a recording at the wrong speed. I thought maybe it was a late picnic. I walked up and found an old man sitting on a log, hands clasped and eyes bright. He looked at me like he had expected me and said, "They took the Thursday out of the week. It's gone." I asked him to explain, and he started to cry, not a violent sob, but the quiet rending of someone whose life had grown seams. He told me his wife used to set the table at noon. She'd gone out to the garden and come back, and the sun had moved like it was correcting itself. She was gone that week. He was certain something in the town had been stealing hours and leaving their lives with stitches. We recorded his statement and found references in decade-old archives, notes from residents about lost Sundays and a year without a harvest that no one could explain. A child in the primary school drew clocks with faces and blank eyes. Parents grew thin with worry because children would misremember lessons or wake up sure they'd already eaten dinner. The county health line got calls about insomnia and slipping schedules. What happened to me was small in the scale of loss, but it stuck to me. I took a lunch break on a bench, and when I finished the sandwich, the wrapper had been folded 3 times and tucked under my hand. I hadn't folded it. Later, a group of teenagers dared each other to sit by the square clock at midnight. 2 of them later told their parents they had dreamt of a house with all the lights on and no one breathing inside. I used to keep a notebook. The pages from that summer are full of sketches of hands and blank faces, and a notation I wrote once and could never erase. Time feels like a pocket emptied. No law enforcement could measure time. They put investigators in the town for a week, took statements, logged medical calls. They recorded names and symptoms, and then closed the file. When I left the reserve that September, the clock had started moving forward again for a few days. Then it stuttered. Months later, I drove past on a return route, and the square was quiet. Someone had nailed a small sign to the base of the clock. For those missing hours. It twigged at me the way a stray word does. I don't know what took those hours. I know only that the people there began to plan as if time could betray them. A shopkeeper in a coastal village remembers an object that didn't belong. I ran the antiquarian on Main Street for 6 years. The shop smelled of old paper and oil, varnish, and the salt that seeped in from the harbor. People brought things in to sell, to pawn, to free themselves of some memory. One winter morning, an older woman came in with a wooden box. She said she'd found it beneath the floorboards of a house being renovated at the edge of town. Her hands trembled when she set it on my counter. The box was plain, ash wood, the sort of crate your grandmother might have used to keep letters. Its lid fit too tight. There was a faint pattern scored along one side, like the grain had been traced many times with a blunt needle. When I opened it, it smelled like rain trapped in a closed room. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a reel of tape, an old cassette. The woman told me not to play it, but to sell it, to make someone else responsible for listening. I had a small vintage player in back because tourists liked retro things, so I told her I'd make an offer and find out if it worked. At night, when the shop was closed and the lights were low, I threaded the tape and hit play. The sound was at first nothing but hiss, the kind of paper breath you hear in dead recordings. Then a voice came. Through a child's voice, like someone speaking down a long tunnel. The child said things that made my skin empty. Names of people I didn't know, dates I couldn't place, and a laugh that became a scraping noise, as if someone had taken a blade across the track. I rewinded and played it at varying speeds. At normal speed, it was a child's lullaby. Speed it up, and it became a sentence. Don't come. Play it backward, and you could hear someone say a place name that matched the branch of road I lived near. I told myself it was the player, the tape's age. But a part of me pressed the pause button and replayed the laugh because it sounded like someone trying to get out. The woman who had brought the box texted me the next week to say she had looked up the house's history and found 2 missing persons notices from decades ago. She apologized and said she didn't want the tape in her home. I kept it locked in the drawer, but then it was not just the tape. For the next month, people who came in to buy postcards would ask about the sound in the shop. Musicians asked to sample it. A teenager came in and left with a small, sad smile. And that night, his mother called me the next day to say he'd refused to sleep in his room because he said the voice was in his head. I mailed the tape to a university lab that studies old media. The report came back with a cautious language about anomalous phonetic artifacts and possible overlay of multiple recordings. They didn't say what it meant. I unpacked the tape once more and found the cloth it was wrapped in had a small prick of salt and a feather tucked beneath it. Simple things that make no logical sense when sewn into a box. I put the tape back in the drawer, and then, one morning, the drawer was empty. The lock was intact, but there was nothing where the tape had been. I changed the padlock and told myself I had misplaced it. I never found it again. Between each of these testimonies, I sifted through the marginal notes and the dispatch logs and spoke with those who survived the nights. Archivists pointed me to clippings that blurred the edges of these stories with other local oddities. A motif of fog, radios, clocks, and vans recurring across years like a pattern in a worn quilt. The people who held these small towns together sometimes protected each other, and sometimes closed ranks in ways that made investigating the quieter phrase of the world hard. There are more accounts. A mill hand who found a man standing in his yard at dawn with eyes like polished glass. A nurse who swore that a patient confessed to visiting a shore that wasn't on any map. A woman who returned to a childhood home to find a child's drawing of her family with one figure traced and then erased. Each voice I recorded had the same ache at its core, a sense that something patient was pressing against the edges of ordinary life, and when someone noticed, the noticing became its own hazard. I have more of these testimonies to share, each with its own small gravity. The next story comes from a maintenance worker on the edge of a mill town and involves a discovery that the community tried to keep quiet. His name was Marcus Reed, and he would not sign anything. He met me in the parking lot outside the hardware store, thin, hunched from years of reaching under machines, hands nicked the way a man's hands get nicked when he has to coax life out of stubborn iron. He spoke low, as if anything louder might set something listening to attention. He kept glancing at the road that led away from town, as if the van might come back the way it had come. Grayfield's small, he said. Everything there moves slow and heavy. Folks mind their own, and when things happen, you patch 'em up or you look the other way. Only problem is, when you patch wrong, it leaks. The mill he worked at sat a half-hour outside of town, a hulking thing of red brick and iron, its smokestack stubbed like a finger pointing at an uncertain sky. In the morning fog, it became a silhouette that breathed steam in long, patient exhales. Marcus said the discovery came while he was on a weekend call. A pipe had burst in the finishing room, and water was seeping into an old part of the foundation. He was supposed to patch it, bolt a flange, and go home. Instead, he found a hatch. It wasn't on any plan, he told me. Floor looked regular. Then the board give like it was tired, and underneath was this lid bolted in. I thought maybe it was just storage. I pried it open. The space beneath the floor was jagged, not like anything a millwright would make. It smelled of damp paper and cold metal. A ladder led down into a room no bigger than a pantry. There were chairs in a circle, cheap folding ones, and an array of objects arranged with a patient deliberateness. A child's raincoat draped over one chair, a stack of paper cups with the rim all bitten the same way, a small radio with its face clouded in age, and a white van key lying on a ragged wool mat. The chairs were facing a chalkboard nailed to the foundation wall, and on that board someone had written a sequence of numbers and letters that to him meant nothing until he noticed the clocks. 3 wall clocks were mounted above the board. Their hands were all stopped at the same minute, 2:17, and they were different brands, different eras. One was a schoolhouse clock with a crack in the glass, one was a cheap alarm clock, and one was a brass kitchen clock with its face yellowed. On a small table beneath the clocks was a tape recorder with one cassette already inside. Marcus thumbed the recorder on and off because his hands acted first and his mouth afterward. He said he listened for less than a minute before he shoved the hatch back and called his supervisor. He told me to close it and don't mention it, Marcus said. Said it was probably just kids sleeping there, transients. I said, kids don't bring clocks. Kids don't lace chairs in a circle like a meeting. He just looked at me like I was making trouble. Marcus had taken 2 photographs with an old phone, quick and grainy. One of the room's center, the chairs and the radio, another of the van key lying in the middle of the mat. In the second photo, if you leaned your head, you could see a smear of something dark along the edge of the rug, like where a shoe had dragged. He sent the photos to a friend at the union, and that is where the story tightened. The friend replied with a single word, "Not ours." Then everyone in the circle of his confidants told him to stop asking questions. The union said keep quiet till the company figures it, Marcus said. The company said don't tell the union. The pastor told me to pray. My landlord told me worrying's bad for the heart. He laughed once, a quick, empty sound. I told my wife. She told me to put it in a drawer and forget it. He stopped and put his head in his hands. She didn't like me going down there. He wrote a brief entry in the mill's maintenance log, something banal about floor access secured, then struck through it and wrote, "Work completed." Later that week, the maintenance supervisor, a man older than most of the men who worked the lines, combed Marcus's hair back with a finger and said, "You ever go poking at old things, Marcus? You find things that come with obligations." Marcus drew the word obligations like a rope around his throat and refused to explain what the supervisor meant, except to say, they don't want the rumor of it to get to the town. But rumors had already started to gather like the fog. An apprentice told me she had seen a white van parked under the ash trees behind Grayfield's Hardware on a Tuesday night the week after Marcus found the hatch. A woman who ran the diner said a man in a raincoat had stopped by and ordered coffee without sugar, and when the usual line of townsfolk asked about him, the proprietor closed her mouth like a drawer shutting on a secret. Marcus himself swore that on an early Sunday, the mill foreman had a crew take down the clocks on the wall and ship them away in a truck that didn't show a company logo. The van became a motif. People in Grayfield spoke of it like an ache in the foot, inconvenient but rarely named. The reports differed only in small ways. Some said the van had no license plate. Others insisted its windows were frosted with a pale film. One teenager told me he'd seen a child scrawl on the back of it, a crude house with a stick figure at the window, and underneath the words, "Gone to the shore." When I went to the scrapyard a county over and asked about vehicles in the last 2 decades, the man at the gate glanced around as if the sky might be listening and said, "Some vans don't get logged." Marcus gave me the photos and a photocopy of the maintenance log. He also gave me a small folded paper, the kind of thing you hide so you can pretend you didn't see it. Inside was a child's drawing, a circle of chairs, 3 clocks with their hands pinned at the same time, and in the lower corner, a crude reel of tape. Beneath the drawing, a name. H. Carter. He said he did not recognize the handwriting. That was in the gutter outside the hatch, Marcus said, like someone shoved it down. I keep thinking someone left it for me to find, or they didn't want someone else to find it, so they hid it. I took it because I needed something to hold. He didn't want to bring the tape recorder home. He said his wife started dreaming about rooms with chairs. She would wake and say there was a voice on the stairs humming a song he couldn't place. He started leaving the photographs in envelopes and pinning them under tack on a bulletin board in the basement of his church. Because there the board was always full of other people's announcements, and they would drown whatever it was he had found. But even in that small anonymity, he felt watched. He stopped sleeping well, he said, and his hands began to make mistakes on the line. A misaligned seam, a fabric ruined. The foreman warned him that more mistakes would cost him his job. I quit showing up for the night shift, Marcus said. I told them I was sick. I told myself I was sick. But you know the thing, when something's set wrong in a place, your body feels it like a cold. It gets in the joints. You think of leaving, and then you remember that your house is mortgaged and your wife's mother needs pills. So you don't leave. You patch. You cover the floor again. I asked him if he had ever played the cassette on the recorder. He said he had not at first. A careful man's superstition, maybe, but the recorder had a protectively dull sheen around its buttons, like it had been used but quickly put away. One night, after too much coffee and too few answers, Marcus sat in his car and pressed play. He told me what happened slowly, as if telling it would call it up faster. It started with that same hiss, he said, then a voice at once too small and too old, a laugh that wasn't laughing, and then it was like the recorder tried to speak more than one thing at once. I heard a place name. I heard East Hollow. I thought, East Hollow's that lane by the Bilton Bridge, my road. I slammed the recorder off. East Hollow. The name matched, in my notes, the place that I had transcribed backward from the first cassette in my shop. The backward place name had been distorted, yes, but the consonants were close enough to make a person with a map nervous. I said nothing of this to Marcus. It was one of those coincidences that felt less like chance and more like a seam showing through thin cloth. 2 weeks later, Marcus stopped answering my messages. His wife told me he had gone to a cousin's in the next county, an excuse the cousin corroborated in a voice that sounded tired. Marcus needed time, she said. He's been through a lot. The pastor who'd told him to pray attended a charity auction wearing a suit that smelled faintly of diesel, and when I cornered him, he smiled with a practiced openness and said, "Sometimes people choose to leave for their own good, and we welcome them back when they're ready." When I asked about the hatch, the pastor's eyes slid to the stooling, and then, as if reciting a doctrine, he said, "We do not rumor about what might unsettle the flock. But people do talk. There is always one person who cracks." For Grayfield, it was a woman named Adele who ran the laundromat and had a habit of leaving the door open even when the wind wasn't obliging. She was the first to tell me about the child who had started leaving small toys in the pockets of the clothes she folded. Tiny plastic soldiers, a button, a feather, things that made no sense given the demographics of the town. Adele said the toys stopped the week they took the clocks. I went to see the basement where Marcus had left his photographs, because sometimes evidence likes to sit where it feels least conspicuous. The church basement smelled of canned soup and varnish. A table was set up for bake sale volunteers. An embroidery hoop dangled from a nail. Tacked to the board where Marcus had pinned his pictures were other things. A notice about soup kitchens, a child's school drawing of a cat, a faded postcard announcing a fair. In the middle of the clutter, someone had stapled another photograph, not Marcus's, a glossy print of the inside of a van. It showed a low bench seat and a child's doodle on the panel next to a radio port. The doodle was the same crude house, with a stick figure at the window. Someone had scribbled on the margin of the photograph in a shaky hand, 2:17. Underneath, another note, taken from the yard behind the mill. That was the same minute as the clocks. The margin handwriting, I learned later, belonged to a woman named June, who had worked the mill's night watch for decades and who had, when pressed, said only, "We took what's ugly and we buried it," and then, with a kind of weary kindness, told me that some stones should stay unturned. When I traced the photograph back to its origin, I was given a slow, shrubby explanation about property disputes and private removals. The man who claimed to have removed the van from the mill's yard said he'd been hired anonymously and paid cash. He described the van as an old delivery rig, white, no markings, like something out of a catalog your neighbor threw away. He was careful to say he had not looked in the back, only the outside, out of respect. Respect here meant he did not want to know what questions to ask. The van, he said, had been towed to a storage lot for a private client and loaded onto a transporter that drove out in the black of an early morning. There was, in these accounts, an economy of silence. Someone paid the man. Someone removed the clocks. Someone bought a van and had it hauled away. The choices were all quiet. The decisions were all cash and nods and the sort of practical sanctimony that made bad things legal. But the objects, the clocks, the chair circle, the child's drawing, the tape, those could not be so easily made to disappear from memory. Back at my shop, I spread the photographs and the drawing across the counter. In the margins of the maintenance log, there was a smudge of a coffee ring like a crescent moon, and on the back of one of Marcus's photos, someone had written in tiny, careful letters, "Don't let them make us forget." I called Marcus's cell and let it ring until it went to voicemail. In the message he left himself, the voice was slower than I remembered and threaded with an exhaustion I could feel through the little tiny speaker. "If I don't get back," his message said, "tell them I tried to look." A week after that, a woman came into my shop. Small, younger than the woman who'd left me the cassette initially, hair pulled back so hard it made the outline of her skull bruised. She did not buy a postcard. She walked to the counter and let her fingers hover over the edge of the glass, as if testing the temperature of the world. She said her name was Lillian Carter. She had a photograph in her hand, the kind taken with an old Instamatic, edges white and thick. She placed it on the glass and without preamble said, "My brother was missing in '84. He liked clocks." The boy in the photograph looked as if the camera had surprised him mid-laugh. His hair was a bowl cut, and he held what might have been a wind-up toy. Underneath, in a child's scrawl I recognized immediately from Marcus's folded paper, was a drawing of a circle of chairs and a tape reel. "My mother kept it," Lillian said. "She used to tell me not to fold it up too tight. She said things are delicate. She died 2 years ago and left me the box. There was a list in there of names, all kids who disappeared in town. My brother's name was on it. I couldn't understand why they had their names and then a time next to them." She tapped the photograph. The time was written, in faded ink. "You've been to Grayfield?" I asked. "A long time," she said. Her expression settled into a kind of patient sorrow. "I left when I could, but some things don't leave you. My mother always said the town had rules. One of them was, don't go looking into the basement. Another was, if you see a van, you look away." She said the last sentence like one might recite a proverb. I kept the box because I thought maybe someone would look. Lillian's voice broke on that last clause. She looked like a woman who had been carrying a cold thing in her hands and had finally set it down. She reached into her jacket and took out a small plastic bag. Inside was a coin, and taped to the coin was a scrap of paper with a single word. East. The coin was warm and slick with age. "I don't know what it means," she said. "My mother wrote it after she found a tape in the laundry. She said East and then circled it like it was wrong." I put the photo of the mill room, the child's drawing, Marcus's maintenance log, and Lillian's coin side by side on the counter. There were too many small things that chimed together like a cluster of bells. The time, the van, the tape, the child's drawings, the clocks. Each item could be explained away on its own. Together, they made a sentence in a language I was only beginning to bruise my tongue on. That night, I sat in my shop with the lights low and the reel-to-reel in my lap. I had the first cassette again, the one the woman had left on my counter and then reclaimed, and then which had vanished and then been returned, and which had finally gone missing altogether. I thought of Marcus crouched at the hatch, of chairs circled like a game that had become a rule, of clocks stopped at the exact same minute in houses that should have nothing in common but a wind and a town's patience. A radio in the shop played a late-night program about old city legends, and intersecting with it, like a chair set in a circle, the hiss on the player's side, and a small, childlike voice told a counting rhyme. I leaned forward, wanting to catch a drift. The rhyme was ordinary until it folded, and then one of the words, not spoken really, but suggested, softened into something like East Hollow. I rubbed at the bridge of my nose. Outside, the street lamps cut the fog into dirty bars. The shop smelled faintly of rain and the resin of old postcards. My hands were quiet on the machine. I had a list growing in my notebook. Grayfield Mill hatch, van towed, clocks removed, tape reels, names, 217, East Hollow. The list looked less like evidence and more like a map of something that would not hold its shape if you tried to pin it down. If there was a pattern here, it had a patience to it. It wanted people to keep their normal rhythms and not run around exposing its neatness. Before I locked the shop, I found the loose photograph of the child's drawing Marcus had left, pinned under a business card on the corkboard. It was folded at one corner, and when I straightened it out, I noticed something new. A tiny smear along the edge where a finger had wiped a line away. And below that, in a cramped adult hand, someone had written a phrase I had not seen before. "Do not play while the clocks are set." The ink was older than the note Lillian had shown me, but it was the same admonition, the same roundness of caution. I called the university lad and left a message, asking if they had any further results. I typed Marcus's name into a public records database and found a string of addresses and a single arrest for a bar fight 20 years prior. I looked up East Hollow on an old map and found a lane that split from Bilton Road and curled along the river like an exhale. It was a place of low hills and an old fisher's dock and a few houses with paint that had long since decided to flake. Nothing on the map suggested ritual or van or tape. Maps are generous in their omissions. The next morning, before the fog burned off, I received a package with no return address. Inside was one of the mill's maintenance logs, the same ledger Marcus had used. Someone had torn out a page, detailed in the same precise blockhand of bureaucratic repair, and across the bottom, someone, not the mill's hand, not the union's, had written, in a pencil that had been chewed down to the nub, "If you see the chairs, you must not sit." There was a phone number scrawled in the margin. It was not a number I recognized. I did not call it immediately. Instead, I walked out back and peered the way my customers sometimes did, down the lane toward East Hollow, and tried to imagine chairs set in a circle under a concrete floor, clocks keeping the same lie. I have been collecting stories because stories feel like the only way to keep a town's forgetting from finishing its work. But some stories are not content to be kept in drawers. They press at hinges and at gaps and at the places where people have told one another to stop looking. I had a sense then that whatever pull held those objects together had room to gather more things, more clocks, more vans, more tape. The thread was long and thin and would not break simply because I preferred it to. I made another note in my book. Call the janitor at the mill who'd been transferred 6 months ago. Call the tow company that had 2 anonymous jobs on a wet Tuesday. Call the union rep who had told Marcus to be quiet. Put the photographs in a safe place and keep the shop door locked after dark. There was one more thing. When I turned to leave, the reel-to-reel on the counter, the one I had not touched in weeks, gave a small click as if acknowledging an invitation. The cassette left inside was not the same as the first woman's. It was unlabeled, but the tape wound to the end as if someone had listened and then set it down improperly. For a moment I thought of Marcus on his car seat at night, pressing play and hearing place names like seashells hold the sound of the ocean. I sat back down. I threaded the tape. The hiss came first, patient as wind through attic slats. Then, very slowly, a voice, not precisely the child's voice of the first reel but close enough to be kin, counted in a muffled way. At the third number, a laugh split the track. Not a child's folly, but something edged, like metal on glass. Then, under the sound, a sequence of words came through so faint and folded, I had to turn the volume up until the speaker complained. It said, or suggested, "Don't come 217 East Hollow." The last syllable smeared into static, like someone trying to speak through a cloth. I shut the player off and sat in the dark length of my own shop with the words sitting in the air like a fugitive. Outside, someone walked by with a dog that yawned and sighed and kept on going. The town had its rhythms. People went to work, children went to school, the postman did his rounds. But beneath those rhythms, something weathered and patient had set its own clock. I made my next note: find the room under the mill. But I did not set a time. I have learned, listening to other people's absences, that can be a mercy and a trap. The clocks around Grayfield had agreed on 2:17 for a reason I did not understand, and stepping into that minute without a preparation felt like standing on the lip of a place that expected you to know some unspoken rules. When I left the shop that afternoon, the sky had turned the color of old paper. I walked home through streets I had known for years and felt, in the muscles just under the shoulder blades, the sense of being watched from an angle no camera can capture. Behind me, doors closed in the way towns close when they are asked to keep a secret they did not agree to keep. I had more names to call, more photographs to compare, more mouths to prod open with questions. But I also knew, from the way people's voices changed when the van was named, that asking too much could unsettle more than silence. Marcus had left a ring of chairs and a tape. Lillian had a photograph and a coin. The town had chosen a set of hands to do the moving and a set of faces to look away. The tape I had just heard was like a key, and keys are poor things until someone turns the lock. I threaded another cassette into the player, not the one the woman had left, but the unlabeled one from the room under the mill, and I pressed play. The hiss came again, and a whisper of melody started beneath it. A simple tune that could have been a lullaby if a lullaby was meant to teach a direction instead of to calm. The voice on the tape said one thing clearly then, and I wrote it down in my notebook with a pen that trembled slightly. Meet at the clocks. They will tell you when to leave. I closed the shop, turned the sign to closed, and walked to the place where the road back to Grayfield curled by the river. Fog sat in the ditch like a sleeping thing. The clock on the wall of the old station house, which worked on its own time, read 1:42. I tried not to think of 2:17, and of chairs, and of the way communities decide which things to bury. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a message I did not open. There were more witnesses I needed to find, and one of them had just stopped answering. I wished for luck in the way a tired animal wishes for rain. The mill sat like an island in the fog, distant and patient. The hatch beneath the floor would be waiting whether I went down or not, and somewhere a van slept in the dark where hands had put it. Somewhere a tape waited to be played again. I unlocked the front door of my house and found, on the kitchen table, a small scrap of paper folded into a triangle. On it, in a hand that might have been tired or steady, was written a time and a place. 2:17, East Hollow Dock. I sat with the scrap a long time, the paper's grain pressed into my palm. The town's rules were no longer other people's rules. They pressed now against the skin of me. Outside, a clock somewhere in the neighborhood chimed a slow, polite hour. The paper in my hand felt like an invitation and a warning in the same breath. I put the scrap in my pocket and went to the window. The road leading out of town vanished into a hand of mist. I wondered, briefly and uselessly, if someone would simply move the circle of chairs somewhere else and set a new time on the clocks, or whether the pattern had a geography that couldn't be altered by towing or by cash. There are things that rotate people into roles: watcher, keeper, mourner, and, for the first time since I had started collecting these testimonies, I realized I might be choosing which role to play. I made coffee and drank it cold. I wrote the names I had so far in a line across a page: Marcus Reed, H. Carter, Lillian Carter, Adele, the laundromat, June, night watch. Beneath them I wrote East Hollow Dock, 2:17. I underlined it once. Before I slept, and the thought of sleeping had begun to seem more like a courtesy than an expectation, I threaded the old cassette from the hatch into my player one last time, and pressed play just to hear the quiet again. The tape offered nothing but its usual breath, and then, beneath it, almost as if someone had leaned close to the microphone and spoken just for me, the voice said a single thin sentence: "If you come, bring a clock." My hand tightened on the cassette until the plastic creaked. I kept that sentence with me like a bruise. There was a riddle in it, a demand that felt ceremonial. Bring a clock. Set the time. Sit in the chairs. Say a child's name. Close the hatch. The rules arranged themselves into something like a ceremony. The town had its reasons for keeping the ceremony hidden. Someone had decided those reasons were more powerful than the grief of missing people. I do not know yet whether bringing a clock is a way in or a way out, but I know now where the next testimony will take me. Beneath the mill's floor, into the room with the chairs, near the clocks stopped at the same minute. There will also be an expectation, and behind that expectation there will be people who have been made careful by whatever occurred there. There will also be people who will not talk, who will smile in small, official ways and say the right thing when asked to look away. I closed my notebook. The tape lay quiet on the counter. Outside, the world kept its. A car starting. A dog barking. Someone locking a door. At 2:17, the town would hold its breath. I decided I would be watching, and that I would bring something with me to count the time. I did not know then whether a clock would be an offering or a tool. I only knew that someone had left an instruction that wanted to be followed, and so I began to prepare.